There's a particular kind of ambition that changes industries, reshapes cities, and rewrites the rules. And then there's a kind that refuses to slow down, refuses to listen, and eventually consumes itself. The story of Travis Kalanick sits right at the intersection of those two forces. It's a story about vision and velocity, about disruption and defiance, and about how the same traits that build an empire can also tear it apart if left unchecked. Travis didn't start out trying to build a villain. He wanted to solve a problem. Anyone who lived in a big city knew the frustration of hailing a cab, waiting endlessly, or dealing with unreliable service. Travis saw inefficiency, and inefficiency bothered him. He believed technology could fix it. And in that belief, there was something powerful. Uber wasn't just a company at first. It was a promise that transportation could be instant, seamless, and always available at the tap of a screen. From the very beginning, Uber moved fast, faster than regulators, faster than competitors, faster than its own ability to pause and reflect. Travis embraced a philosophy of relentless aggression. He believed rules were obstacles, not safeguards. Cities that resisted Uber weren't partners to persuade, they were enemies to defeat. And that mindset spread through the company like wildfire. Growth became everything. New cities launched almost overnight. Drivers signed up by the thousands. Riders became addicted to convenience. And investors loved it. Money poured in, valuations soared, and Travis became the face of a new Silicon Valley archetype. The fearless founder who didn't ask for permission. Uber wasn't just growing, it was dominating. And Travis thrived in that environment. The pressure, the conflict, the battles, they energized him. But here's the quiet truth I've learned after watching many founders rise and fall. Intensity is not the same as leadership. Aggression can open doors, but it can also break the hinges. And inside Uber, cracks were forming long before the public ever noticed. The culture reflected its founder: hard-driving, competitive, unforgiving. Employees were encouraged to win at all costs. Success was rewarded loudly. Failure was punished quickly. That kind of environment can produce results in the short term, but it comes with a price. People stop speaking honestly, ethics become flexible, and empathy becomes optional. Travis didn't just tolerate that culture, he celebrated it. Stories circulated about executives bending rules, about internal rivalries, about behavior that crossed lines but went unchecked. And when leadership sends that message, that results matter more than conduct, people listen. As Uber expanded, so did the controversies. Regulators pushed back, lawsuits piled up, cities threatened bans. Instead of slowing down to address concerns, Uber often chose confrontation. Secret software was reportedly used to evade regulators. Aggressive lobbying campaigns were launched. The company began to look less like an innovator and more like a bully. But Travis remained defiant. To him, resistance only proved Uber was winning. Then came the scandals that could no longer be ignored. Allegations of sexual harassment surfaced, revealing a workplace where complaints were dismissed and accountability was absent. A blog post by a former employee described a culture of intimidation and discrimination, and it struck a nerve. Suddenly, Uber wasn't just a disruptive tech company. It was a symbol of everything people criticized about Silicon Valley: excess. Investors grew uneasy. The board grew concerned. The public image deteriorated rapidly. And Travis, who once controlled every narrative, found himself reacting instead of leading. The confidence that once seemed unshakable now looked like stubbornness. The aggression that once drove growth now fueled backlash. I've seen this pattern before. When leaders confuse control with strength, they resist change even when change is necessary. Travis believed Uber needed him exactly as he was. But the company had outgrown the very traits that created it. What once felt like courage now looked like recklessness. What once felt like confidence now looked like ego. The turning point came quietly, not with a single dramatic event, but with accumulating pressure. Board members began discussing leadership changes. Major investors questioned Travis's ability to guide the company forward. And for the first time, Travis faced a reality he hadn't prepared for. Uber might succeed without him. Being forced out of your own company is a particular kind of heartbreak, especially when that company feels like an extension of your identity. Travis didn't just lose a job. He lost control of the story he thought he was writing. And in Silicon Valley, that kind of loss is often harder to accept than financial failure. This was only the beginning of the fall. The deeper story lies in how power slipped away, how trust eroded, and how a founder who once embodied innovation became a liability to his own creation. And as we'll see next, the decisions that forced Travis out didn't happen overnight. They were years in the making. As Uber continued to grow at a breathtaking pace, the distance between what the company looked like on the outside and what it felt like on the inside grew wider every year. From the outside, it was a marvel of modern business, an app that changed how people moved through cities, a brand recognized around the world, a valuation climbing into the tens of billions. But inside the walls of the company, the culture was beginning to crack under the weight of its own intensity. And those cracks, once formed, have a way of spreading quietly. The pressure to win at all costs created an environment where people felt disposable. Long hours were expected. Aggressive behavior was tolerated. Questioning leadership was discouraged. In that kind of setting, the loudest voices dominate, while the cautious ones fade into silence. Travis believed that speed was everything, that hesitation meant losing ground, but speed without reflection often leads you straight into trouble. One of the most damaging aspects of Uber's culture was the lack of accountability at the top. Complaints about misconduct were often brushed aside, internal investigations stalled. Executives who delivered results were protected, even when their behavior crossed clear ethical lines. And when employees see that rules apply differently depending on your position, trust erodes quickly. The company's problems spilled into public view when a former engineer published a detailed account of sexual harassment and retaliation inside Uber. It wasn't vague, it wasn't anonymous, it was specific, personal, and devastating. Suddenly, the stories employees had whispered about were being read by millions, and the response from leadership mattered more than ever. Travis's reaction revealed a deeper issue. Instead of immediately acknowledging the systemic failures, he initially treated the situation as a public relations problem rather than a cultural one. Apologies came slowly. Responsibility was diluted, and the sense that leadership truly understood the damage felt absent. In moments like that, people don't just listen to what you say. They listen to how quickly you say it, how sincerely you mean it, and whether your actions match your words. Around the same time, other incidents began to surface. A video emerged showing Travis arguing aggressively with an Uber driver, dismissing the driver's concerns and refusing to take responsibility. It was a small moment caught on camera, but it carried enormous weight. To many people, it confirmed what they already suspected, that the company's combative culture came straight from the top. Regulators also grew less patient. Cities around the world pushed back harder. Legal battles intensified. Uber's aggressive tactics, once seen as bold, now looked reckless. The company had spent years acting as if it were above the rules, And eventually, the rules pushed back, hard. Inside the boardroom, conversations became more serious. Investors who once admired Travis's fearlessness now worried about his judgment. The company was preparing for an eventual public offering, and the risk profile was becoming unacceptable. A founder who thrived on chaos is often the wrong leader for a company that needs stability. Travis, however, struggled to accept that reality. Like many founders, he saw Uber as his creation, his identity, his legacy. Stepping back felt like surrender, and surrender was not a language he spoke. He believed that only he truly understood the company's mission. Only he could fight the battles that mattered. But leadership isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to change tactics. An independent investigation was launched to examine Uber's culture and practices. The findings were sobering. Dozens of recommendations were made to reform leadership, improve accountability, and rebuild trust. The message was clear. Uber needed to change, and that change had to start at the top. When Travis took a leave of absence, it was framed as temporary, a chance to reset, a pause, not an ending. But pauses have a way of becoming permanent when the people left behind realize the company functions better without constant conflict. The board began pushing for new leadership, someone calmer, someone steadier, someone who could guide Uber into its next phase without the baggage of its past. The pressure mounted quietly but relentlessly. Investors called, advisors weighed in, and eventually, Travis faced a decision that many founders fear more than failure: step aside or be forced out. In the end, the choice was made for him. He resigned as CEO, no longer in control of the company he had built from the ground up. The moment marked a turning point not just for Uber, but for Travis himself. Power, once lost, is rarely regained in the same form. And while he remained a significant shareholder, his influence was gone. The company moved forward under new leadership, focused on repairing relationships, complying with regulations, and calming a culture that had been running on adrenaline for far too long. What's striking is how preventable much of this was. The warning signs were there early: toxic behavior, unchecked authority, resistance to feedback. These are not subtle signals. They are loud, clear indicators of trouble ahead, but success has a way of muting those alarms. When things are going well financially, people convince themselves that everything else will sort itself out. Uber survived Travis's departure. In many ways, it had to. The company was bigger than any one person by then, but the cost of that survival was immense. Trust had to be rebuilt. Culture had to be reshaped. And the story of its founder became inseparable from its early mistakes. In the next part, we'll look at what happened after Travis lost control, how Uber transformed, how Travis struggled with his fall from power, and what this story teaches about leadership, ego, and knowing when to step aside. When Travis Kalanick finally stepped away from the CEO's chair, something unusual happened inside Uber. The noise quieted, the urgency softened, decisions slowed just enough to be examined rather than reacted to. For the first time in years, the company began behaving less like a battlefield and more like a business. That change alone said more than any press release ever could. Because when a leader leaves and the organization breathes easier, it tells you something important about what had been weighing it down. New leadership arrived with a different temperament. Calm replaced confrontation, listening replaced shouting, and slowly, almost cautiously, Uber began repairing the damage that years of unchecked aggression had caused. Relationships with regulators improved. Internal policies were rewritten. Accountability structures were strengthened. None of this was exciting. None of it made headlines the way Uber once did. But it was necessary. Sustainable companies are rarely built through constant chaos. They're built through boring, disciplined decisions made consistently over time. For Travis, watching this transformation from the outside must have been deeply unsettling. Founders often believe they are irreplaceable, that the company's success is inseparable from their presence. And in the early days, that can be true. But over time, a business evolves. What it needs at one stage may be very different from what it needs later. Uber no longer needed a fighter. It needed a steward. Travis still owned a large stake in the company, and financially, he remained wealthy. But wealth isn't the same as influence. And influence once lost is hard to regain. He no longer set the tone. He no longer shaped the culture. He no longer decided the direction. For someone who had lived in a constant state of control, that loss was profound. There's a quiet pain that comes with realizing the world keeps moving without you, that your creation adapts, survives, and even improves in your absence. It forces a difficult question: was I the reason for its success, or was I becoming the reason for its struggles? That's not an easy thing to sit with, especially for someone whose identity is so tightly woven into their work. Public perception shifted as well. Travis was no longer seen as the bold disruptor challenging outdated systems. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that innovation doesn't excuse behavior, that growth doesn't justify toxicity, and that leadership at its core is about responsibility, not dominance. Uber's path forward wasn't smooth. The company still faced legal challenges, financial losses, and a difficult road toward profitability. But the tone had changed. The message to employees was different. Respect mattered now, ethics mattered now, long-term stability mattered now. These weren't dramatic changes, but they were meaningful ones. I've often said that character shows itself most clearly when power is taken away, when applause fades, when authority disappears. Travis faced that moment publicly, and like many before him, he struggled with it. There were attempts to reassert relevance. New ventures were explored. Statements were made, but nothing carried the same weight as before. The world had moved on, and yet there's something deeply human in this story. Travis wasn't born reckless, he wasn't born toxic. He was shaped by incentives, by rewards that celebrated aggression and ignored its consequences. Silicon Valley often praises founders who break things, but it doesn't always stay around to help clean up the mess. Travis played the role he was encouraged to play until the costs became too visible to ignore. That doesn't excuse the harm caused. Employees were hurt, reputations were damaged, trust was broken. Those things matter. But understanding how these situations arise helps prevent them from repeating. Because Travis isn't unique, he's one example of a pattern that shows up again and again when ambition outruns self-awareness. What could have changed the outcome? Perhaps a stronger board earlier on. Perhaps advisors willing to challenge him instead of celebrating him. Perhaps a moment of reflection before aggression became culture. Small changes made early often prevent large disasters later. But once momentum builds, slowing down becomes harder with every step. Uber's survival without Travis proved an uncomfortable truth. Companies can outgrow their founders. The skills that ignite growth are not always the same skills that sustain it. Knowing when to evolve and when to step aside is one of the most difficult lessons a leader can learn. Many never do. As the years passed, Uber continued its journey, imperfect but steadier, and Travis became part of its history rather than its future. His name would always be linked to the company's rise, but also to its darkest chapters. That's a complicated legacy, one filled with both innovation and regret. In the final part, we'll step back and reflect on what this story really teaches us about power, humility, leadership, and the quiet discipline required to build something that lasts longer than the person who started it. When the story of Travis Kalanick is finally told in full, it won't be just a story about Uber. It will be a story about leadership, about restraint, and about the quiet wisdom that often gets ignored when success arrives too quickly. Because this wasn't a collapse caused by bad luck or a single mistake. It was the slow result of choices made again and again, each one small enough to justify in the moment, but powerful enough to shape a dangerous direction over time. Travis believed deeply in fighting. Fighting competitors, fighting regulators, fighting critics, fighting anyone who stood in Uber's way. And in the beginning, that mindset worked. The world rewarded him for it. Growth came fast. Valuations exploded. Headlines praised his boldness. But the world has a way of changing the rules without announcing it. What once looks like courage can quietly turn into recklessness. What once feels like confidence can slowly harden into arrogance. There's an old idea in business that the greatest risk often comes disguised as success. When things go right for too long, we stop listening, we stop questioning, we stop noticing the small warning signs that appear along the road. Travis didn't lose Uber in a single dramatic moment. He lost it gradually, by ignoring signals that were asking him to slow down and look inward. The culture he allowed to grow inside Uber didn't appear overnight. It was shaped by what was rewarded and what was ignored. Aggression was rewarded, results were rewarded, behavior was overlooked, respect was optional. And over time, people learn exactly what a company truly values, not from speeches, but from consequences, or the lack of them. When scandals surfaced, they weren't just PR problems, they were reflections of leadership. Culture always flows downhill. Employees don't invent values, they mirror them. And when leadership fails to draw clear lines, chaos fills the space. What makes this story especially painful is that it didn't have to end this way. Travis was smart, visionary, relentless. Those qualities built Uber. But leadership requires something quieter too: humility, the ability to hear uncomfortable truths, the discipline to change before change is forced upon you. There's a moment every leader faces, often privately, when they must choose between being right and being wise, between winning today and surviving tomorrow. Travis consistently chose the fight, and eventually the fight turned inward, consuming the very foundation he stood on. When the board finally acted, it wasn't betrayal, it was preservation. Investors didn't remove Travis because they hated him. They removed him because they believed the company could no longer survive under his leadership. That's a brutal realization for any founder, that the thing you built needs protection from you. After his exit, Travis largely disappeared from the daily spotlight. No more all-hands speeches, no more war metaphors, no more defiant interviews, just distance. And silence has a way of forcing reflection. Whether Travis embraced that reflection fully, only he knows. But the lesson remains for anyone watching from the outside. Power amplifies who we already are. It doesn't change us, it reveals us. And when power arrives faster than maturity, it can expose weaknesses before we're ready to face them. That's why the most enduring leaders often move slowly, speak carefully, and surround themselves with people who are unafraid to disagree. Uber today is a different company, still imperfect, still evolving, but steadier, more deliberate, less reactive. And that transformation didn't come from innovation alone. It came from restraint, from learning that not every battle is worth fighting, and not every criticism is an attack. Travis Kalanick didn't lose everything. He still has wealth, he still has experience, he still has time. But he lost something far more difficult to reclaim: the trust to lead what he created. That loss is invisible, but it's deeply personal. If there's one quiet truth this story leaves us with, it's this: success is not proven by how fast you grow, but by how long you endure. Companies don't collapse because of one bad quarter. Leaders don't fall because of one bad day. They fall when they confuse momentum with meaning and noise with progress. The real tragedy isn't that Travis was forced out of Uber. The real tragedy is that the warning signs were there long before it happened. And like so many before him, he mistook speed for strength and control for leadership. In the end, Uber survived. The market moved on, and the world found its next disruptive hero. But this story remains quiet, heavy, and instructive. A reminder that greatness requires more than vision. It requires patience, self-awareness, and the humility to know when it's time to change. Because in business, as in life, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest. And the leaders who last the longest are often the ones who learn to listen, especially when it's hardest to do so.